Thank you, Pete, and also thank you, Sergey, both of you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to talk to you today, even if it is at this distance. So what I want to do in this talk is focus on Africa and focus on the demographics and environmental context in which we evolved. And I think this is important to try to understand why we are different from other hominins. It is also extremely difficult because the African fossil record is not rich. And also we don't have many ancient genomes from Africa. But I think that we can find enough information to put some boundaries on the estimates. So I will start with where I started. And that was in the late 1980s, when the biggest question was, did modern humans evolve multiregionally across the world, or did they? So what I was saying was at that time, when the first out of Africa formal models came on board, it was a very exciting moment and a lot of discussion, and then a lot of evidence accumulated following that. So for one, the premises of the multi-regional model that required that change was synchronous because it was evolving as a climb, that there were continuities in regional morphologies, and so those were proven not to be the case. And then all modern humans have the shared derived features that are not present in their cakes. And then modern humans, the fossils of modern humans were significantly older in Africa than Eurasian. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, the evidence for an out of Africa model continued to accumulate. So on the one hand, it was shown clearly that living Africans have much more diversity than the people of the rest of the world. And this is beautifully shown by a study of Andrea Manica and colleagues, who they show, as you can see on the map, that diversity decreases, genetic diversity decreases with distance from Africa, and also they could show it on phenotypic diversity. We also had new dates for old fossils, like the fossil of Homo discovered by Richard Leakey in the 60s, and also the discovery of the fossil of Herto. Both these fossils are from Ethiopia, and they have distinct modern human traits. During this time, we also had the first ancient genomes of Neanderthals. So first of all, the study or the mitochondrial DNA of the Neanderthal fossil that showed that Neanderthals are a sister clade to humans, and that humans decrease in diversity once outside Africa. And then in the mid-2000s, the first nuclear genome, which again confirmed the findings that of Neanderthals and humans as sister clades. But it also gave a deeper time to the split between humans and Neanderthals. This was followed by an enormous amount of work on ancient genomes, and this makes the field just so exciting. So first of all, the discovery of a new hominin, the one that we call Denisovan, and this was it's a population from the Altai Mountains in Siberia, and the first results came from the mitochondrial DNA, and this showed a deep lineage in Eurasia of an unknown hominin, and that it was a sister clade, so a sister group to Neanderthals and modern humans. A few years later, they extract ancient DNA from fossil from the Cima de los Huesos in Atapuerca in Spain, and they obtained also the mitochondrial DNA that corroborated that Middle-Pleistocene hominins of Eurasia were aligned to Denisovans. Afterwards, this picture changed. So once the nuclear DNA of Denisovans was obtained, it showed that in fact, Neanderthals and Denisovans form a group. They share a common ancestor separate from modern humans. And this was later proven as well with the proteome, the ancient proteome of a mandible from Tibet. This study of Denisovans also brought to light the amount of potential admixture and assimilation that happened between humans and Neanderthals, between humans and Denisovans, and between Denisovans and Neanderthals. So a rich landscape now for the genetic information of Eurasian hominins. So going back to the beginning, to the out of African and multiregional models, what can we say? So the multiregional model, with its original requisite that it was evolving in clines, that there was gene flow throughout the world, and so on, that clearly was not the case. But the out of Africa model, once you have more than one point of contact and you have assimilation rather than replacement, that was also not the correct model. So now we work with a model in which we see the evolution of modern humans happening in Africa, Africans being the root and more diverse than the rest of the world, and a sister group that contains the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, and with a level of genetic exchange once these populations became in contact with each other. So this view, this perspective on the evolution of modern humans and Eurasian late quaternary hominins is consistent with the fossil record. So in this fussy slide here, you can see the early hominins that made it out of Africa, so Homo erectus, the establishment of Homo erectus in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, populations of early Homo, Homo eorgicus perhaps, and the establishment of Homo Ancestor in Europe. So these populations, they represent a group of hominins that descend from those very early dispersals out of Africa 2 million years ago. You will see also, you'll notice that there are lots of gaps in this record. But you also see that there's another group of hominins represented here in a picture of Bodo or the Atapuerca and Petralona material in Europe that are different. They're similar to each other. They share aspects of their archaeology, and they mark this Middle-Pleistocene Eurasian and African contact. We also have evidence from the fossils that the European hominins in the Middle Pleistocene evolved into Neanderthals, and that in the Middle Pleistocene of East Asia, there's an increasing, rapidly growing number of fossils showing a very different morphology from the preceding Homo erectus. So we assume that there was a population also somewhere in Southeast Asia, perhaps also related to the Denisovans, as represented by the Ziae mandible in Tibet. So this makes a picture of what happened, of how the fossils actually fit this ancient genomic evidence. And what I want to do now is think, what is actually happening in Africa? So we can use some of these ancient genomic evidence to give a chronological boundary to our own lineage. So we know from the genomics, there's a good estimate of the time of separation of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, and that's estimated to be between 400 and 450,000 years ago. But we also have, although with very broad brackets, as you can see, an estimate of when the ancestor of Neanderthals and Denisovans separated from the ancestor of ourselves, our own ancestor, Homo sapiens, and that is estimated to be around 700,000 years ago. We can also add another element to this historical aspect, which is the number of dispersals that may have taken place during the Middle Pleistocene. So if I go back a slide to this one, I drew these as two separate lineages, but now we know clearly that this is not the case, that there were several points of contact. And the evidence comes from two beautiful recent studies, one using the mitochondrial DNA of the fossil of Hohenstein-Stadel, and the other one using studying the Y chromosome, full Y chromosome of Neanderthals. And what they show, if you remember that story where I started with the material from Denisova, in which I said that the mitochondrial DNA placed Denisova separate from Neanderthals and modern humans. And that's because the mitochondrial DNA of Neanderthals, it is like ours. What they have found is that the Y chromosome of Neanderthals, it's also like ours, and unlike the Denisovans. And what this points out now with these two beautiful parallel studies is that between 400 and 300,000 years ago, there was a dispersal from Africa to Europe, didn't get into Eurasia as a whole. And the Denisovans had already split from the Neanderthals. And these Africans, they intermix with the Neanderthals and in fact replace the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA. So this is a strong evidence that there was a dispersal of a population related to ourselves that migrated into Western Eurasia and impacted on the biology of Neanderthals. For me and for Rob Foley, this makes a lot of sense. Because one of the features of the record at this time is a major change in the archaeology. And this comes with the appearance of a new lithic tradition that we call Mode 3, that it's based on a change in the way that the cores are knapped and the flakes are produced. And this appears at a similar time, both in Europe and in Africa. However, because the evidence was that Neanderthals were evolving in Europe and modern humans were evolving in Africa beyond the time of this Mode 3 technology, they were thought to be two independent, very convergent, very similar inventions. However, with a dispersal around 300,000 years ago from Africa to Western Eurasia, we can also account for this, the dissemination of these lithic traditions from one continent to the other. The evidence for contact between Africa and Western Eurasia at this time it's also in the form of fossils. So recently, the fossil of Apidima in Greece, dating to 210,000 years ago, was shown by Katerina Harbati and her group to actually have affinities towards modern humans rather than Neanderthals. And equally, the fossil of Miss Leah in Israel, dating to 190,000 years ago, also shows modern human affinities. So what we have here is a period in which there is increased contact between the African lineage and the Western Eurasian lineage, leading to Neanderthals. So we can depict it this way and think of it as so if you recall, we have all these represented in gray here, all these early populations that descend from early out of Africa 2 million years ago. And then we have this middle Pleistocene population, perhaps starting at 700,000 years ago, that gives rise to modern humans in Africa, Neanderthals in Western Eurasia, and Denisovans in Eastern Eurasia. But we also have now evidence of all these different points of contact between the African and the Western Eurasian populations. So I want to now try to understand what is happening in Africa at this time. Are modern humans, could we trace the origins of modern humans all the way back to the origins of this lineage? What is the context in which modern humans are evolving in Africa? And for that, I want to start by looking at the climate first. So there's a lot of information about the climatic changes in the last few million years. And I'm going to try to very briefly summarize what we know. So in your slide, you can see a graph of the last 5 million years and the estimate of global temperatures. So you can, as we know, from 3 million years onwards, the world's climate got cooler. And then there is a major period of instability that we know as the early to middle Pleistocene transition, in which there's a shift between a 41,000 year cycle of climate change to one that is shaped around 100,000 years. And the amplitude of these glacial cycles also increased. So there's a major shift in the world's climate around 1 million years ago. And we can see it clearly if we blow up the end of that curve, and you can see that not only the length of the cycles has changed, but the amplitude has changed. And also, most importantly, for the relationship between populations in Africa and populations in Eurasia, is that these cycles are asymmetrical and they end abruptly. And that ending, when it suddenly warms up, the Sahara also greens. However, in the tropics, the relationship between this global climate and the glacial cycles and the ecology is mediated through precipitation. And that gives a different pattern of relationship, which is actually related to the eccentricity and the precessional cycles of the orbital system. And so what you can see that superimposed over those glacial cycles that we just saw, you have periods of eccentricity minima and eccentricity maxima. And they have different effects on the hydrology of Africa because they either amplify or dampen the effect of the tropical monsoons. So during eccentricity minima, the monsoons are weak and there's increased aridity in East Africa in particular, and what's called a yellow Sahara phase. When you have eccentricity maxima is when you get massive monsoons, but then they're also separated by very dry phases. So there's alternation between green Saharas and desert Sahara. And of course, the green of the Sahara is a precondition for all these dispersals that we're talking about. What you see on top of this graph here, it's an adaptation of a beautiful curve that it's called an index of aridity done by Grant and colleagues and published in 2017. And it marks the periods of when you had greening of the Sahara and also how they match the sapropels of the Mediterranean, which is a part of the evidence for discharge of the Nile into the Eastern Med. So what we see using this index of aridity, we can actually pinpoint the moments when the Sahara is likely to have been green. It doesn't mean that the hominins or the faunas used it as a corridor at that time, but those are moments in which that could happen. But it also marks the periods when Africa was extremely dry and the populations would have contracted and fragmented. For us, for me, one of the most interesting things is this period between 950,000 and about 650,000. This is a period of a mega drought. It happens at the end of the early Middle-Pleistocene transition, and it is the driest and longest dry phase, certainly in the last million years. And that coincides with the time when our lineage and the lineage of Neanderthals and Denisovans last were one, when they split. And for me, what this is telling me is that this is a moment in which African hominins are fragmenting, splitting, and one of those eventually survives and gives rise to Neanderthals and Denisovans, and another one survives and gives rise to Homo sapiens later on. There may have been many others of which destiny we know very little. Thinking about the aridity and the wet episodes also makes sense of this period towards the end of the Middle Pleistocene. So this is a series of wet episodes that suggests that African populations had the potential or the ecological potential to expand and to not only cross the Sahara, maybe disperse into Eurasia, but expand throughout Africa. And this is for me, makes a lot of sense of what we see in the fossil record. So this is a moment where we have the fossil of Jebel Hood, which was known for a long time. It was discovered in 1961, but there have been new recent discoveries at the site of Jebel Hood, published by Jean-Jacques Houblin and colleagues recently, and in particular, mandible that shows an incipient chin, one of the derived unique features of Homo sapiens. And for me, if you have a face in which African Homo sapiens is expanding and contracting and changing as it goes along, it also explains why we may have such deep structure within the African populations of modern humans. And the big question is then, what happened before these early sapiens populations? And can we think about the conditions, the process, and what may have been the selective pressures at that time? So the biggest question, I guess, about that moment is whether the evolution of modern humans was local or Pan-African. Recently, Ellis, Carey, and colleagues published a paper saying that our African lineage was deeply structured for a long time and exchanging genes so that we have a Pan-African origin. And Hena Bren and colleagues published a lovely paper in which they explore all the different models that may explain the origins of modern humans in Africa, and which is more likely or less likely given the current genetic evidence. What I want to stress, I guess, is that if we add the fossil record, the hominin fossil record to that, we have a situation, data that are difficult to reconcile with a Pan-African population of a single lineage. So what we see, these are hominins that are either known or thought to date between 400 and 200,000 years ago. So I've already mentioned the fossil of Jebel Hood with that incipient chin. There's also the fossil of Florisbad in Southern Africa with some features that are possibly shared with modern humans. But we also have the recently dated fossil from Kabwe, which is completely different, also dated to 300,000 years ago, and so on. And most of all, we have the fossils of Homo naledi. And as we all know, Homo naledi is a small brain hominin with a brain in the order of 500 cubic centimeters. But it's not just that it has a small brain. Homo naledi is a mosaic completely. It has a shoulder that is more like an Australopithecine shoulder with cranially oriented scapula. It has hands that are in some aspects extremely modern, and so it's a very complex mosaic fossil that exists at the same time as this very large brain, some with incipient modern features, others also with very archaic looking faces. And very soon after, at 200,000 years ago, you have these fully modern humans. So this is a moment that in fact suggests major boundaries between populations in Africa. I am not saying that there couldn't be more than one population interbreeding in Africa at this time. And in fact, I think that the moments that there were major dispersals, there must have been contact and there must have been some assimilation. But it's difficult to think that the whole continent was evolving as a single gene pool. I also think that there is, besides the diversity of hominins, there are other indicators that what happens around 300,000 years ago is a major event. So on the one hand, we have this mega drought deep in the history of our lineage, for which time we have almost no fossils, except a few hominins that are of extremely small body size. So I separated them here in a column of the small African Homo, of which, of course, Naledi is a much younger taxon. We then have these late surviving, what is called archaics, Homo heidelbergensis or Homo rhodesiensis. The names don't matter because, as we know, in Eurasia, they are also shaping, they also have assimilation and interaction later on. So these are populations, but these populations are extremely different and fully contemporaneous with the earliest fossils that have evidence of belonging to Homo sapiens. We also see at that time a major shift in the technology. I've already mentioned the appearance of mode 3 technologies. So the mode 3 in Africa, we call it the Middle Stone Age, which is found with Jebel Ihud, it is found with Homo kibish and all these modern fossils. It's a major reorganization of the technological system. And through mostly the work of John Tyler Faith and colleagues, and the fact that there is an important fauna turnover that also happens at this time with a distinct decrease in the number and size of the largest members of the African fauna at this point. So in fact, I think that with the origins of Homo sapiens, we have something significant and unique. So let's look what could make humans so different at that time. So when we define modern humans, there's a list that we can find in any textbook, and of which, universal to all humans, we only find the tall, this tall rounded cranium, so basically a very high vault and rounded, not necessarily larger or smaller than Neanderthals, but a different shape, and the chin on a mandible, the mental eminence. The importance of this, the change in shape of the skull has been stressed recently by a beautiful study by Philip Goons and colleagues, in which they show that, in fact, they can estimate an index of endocranial shape that gives the globularity of the human head, and that they can make genomic associations between the human head and the Neanderthal introgress fragments. And so that this is truly a genetic expression possibly related to neurogenesis and myelination. So certainly a change in the shape of the brain characterizes the origins of modern humans. And this is also consistent in a paper last year, Karina Slebush, she was studying complete genomes, 25 complete genomes of Khoisan, and they could estimate signals of selection before the origins of the lineage. And one of the strongest areas that gave signals of ancient selection was aspects of neurogenesis. I would add to this list our unique life history. So humans have a life history, so that the periods in which of development and aging throughout our life, that is different, as we know, from apes and Australopithecines. And in particular, we have a long life history that includes other phases like childhood and menopause. And I will take you back to the early Homo to see how significant this is in modern humans. So this is a study by Christine in 2016. And what you see in your graph, if you look at the graphs below, in red and blue is the growth curve in stature, and not the growth curve, excuse me, is the curve of stature and weight in children aged between 7 and 10 years old. And on the y-axis is a density curve for the completion of the second premolar crown as a measure of maturity. And what you can see is that they estimated the stature and the weight of the fossil of the Turkana boy, came in WT 15,000. So it's an early Homo erectus, 1,600,000 years old, and also the juvenile from Dmanisi. And these two fossils are also thought to have an age between 7 and 10 years old. And what you can see that for their age, they are already very tall and very heavy. This matters because what it's telling us that the ancestral Homo has shifted body size, but that body size is actually achieved through fast growth. So this is energetically very demanding and probably associated with shifts in diet, possibly carnivory, and so on. But it's ecologically very effective because it gives an early independence and minimizes predator risk. But it's also social and behaviorally challenging because you have to increase the role of protection, innovative solutions for the diet, perhaps even cooking. But then if we consider what do we know about modern humans, and this is a study published last year by Russell Hogg, including Chris Dean, on Retzius periodicity across hominins. And the Retzius periodicity, which is the number of days between the deposition of successive long period growth lines in the teeth. So in tooth enamel, those are the striae of Retzius. And what they point is that humans have a uniquely different pattern from all the other hominins and hominids. So this means that we actually have a very high energy budget and that is a fast life history in relation to apes, but we have a long juvenile period and a long lifespan. So we have a slow life history in that respect. So we have a unique combination. And what is important about the Retzius periodicity is that it reflects neuroendocrine biorhythms, and it is thought to be responding to to brain hypothalamic processes. So this is a measure of how humans are actually unique in how we develop. And that gives us a departure from all ancestral Homo. So we are energetically efficient because we can budget our development throughout a longer ontogeny. This is ecologically very challenging because we have then a longer dependence on the mother and a bigger risk of predation. And social and behavioral extremely demanding because mothers may need to be provisioned because if they have dependent children, social cohesion and belonging needs to happen in order to protect those children, major pressures on new technological solutions, and perhaps increased dependence on learning and social norms and skills. So for me, this could be an indication that what we have is the evolution of modern human hunter-gatherer societies where the role of kin and non-kin, as shown beautifully by a study of Andrea Miliano a few years ago, the changes in family units, foraging units, social units into multi-level societies, and then creating the shared social norms, identities, and histories that characterize all modern societies. So in my view, around 300,000 years ago, we have a major adaptive change among African hominins, and that is related to the origins of Homo sapiens. And this is consistent with the massive change in demography that happens afterwards, and also the accumulation of innovative behaviors, of which we see the beginnings in the subsequent record in Southern Africa and also in various parts of Africa, but in Southern Africa particularly rich. However, having said that, we have such enormous, major, outstanding issues. So first, I want to raise the issue of who was the last common ancestor of humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. So this is a population that probably lived during that mega drought in Africa, 900 to 700,000 years ago. It was probably one of several fragmented populations, and we don't know who they are. In fact, the fossils we have in Africa at that time that possibly fit within this period, which are not many, so Dak and Bui are actually about 1 million years old, they're all extremely different from each other. We also have not clear what is the role of Homo antecessor in this picture. And it could be that the separation and presence of this lineage also marks North versus sub-Saharan African trajectories. This leads to another major issue. So if the ancestor of Sapiens, Denisovans, Neanderthals lived in Africa 800, 700,000 years ago, but Neanderthals only separated from Denisovans 450,000 years ago. Where were they in between? So one possibility is that actually the Neanderthals and Denisovan lineages only separate during the out of Africa dispersal. This would imply that in fact, then they're living in Africa before that. So it could be that some of those Middle Pleistocene African fossils are more closely related to Neanderthals and Denisovans than they are to ourselves. Another possibility is that they actually disperse out of Africa right away. In which case, the question is, where is this ancestral population before Neanderthals and Denisovans differentiate from each other? And what fossils in Eurasia match that condition? And where were they if they're not in China? In China, the fossils of non-Homo erectus are relatively recent, younger than 350,000 years ago. So where were the Denisovans before that? So these are major issues, and they involve both Africa and Eurasian fossils. Another major outstanding issue is what is the adaptive niche of this very small African Homo? So we have other lineages of late quaternary small hominins in Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis. But somehow, because they're in islands, they're isolated, we can call into island processes to explain them. But naledi, we have new fossils from Turkana that are also more likely to be within this group of very small African Homo in the Middle Pleistocene. And indeed, the fossil from Olorgesailie that Rick Potts described a number of years ago. So what role do they play? What technology did they have? What was the relationship with modern humans 300,000 years ago? Another outstanding issue is that when we're trying to think who modern humans evolved from, we tend to think of their relationship with Neanderthals, and yet they must have separated from another African population. So who were those competing populations in Africa for which at the moment we have such a poor fossil record? In fact, if we put on a map the fossils in Africa between 400 and 250,000 years ago, including Naledi, you can see that our knowledge at the moment is so incomplete that there is no possibility that we can answer that question. And finally, how deep is the population structure of African Homo sapiens? This matters a lot because if human populations have living descendants that is structured from each other, separated from each other at the time of fossils like Florisbad or Naledi, 250,000 years ago, as it's suggested by some genetic results like those of Karine Slebush and colleagues, then we are talking of ecologies and regional boundaries and social boundaries amongst hominins that are very profound. Other studies suggest that actually that structure is not that deep and emerged mostly in the last 130,000 years. And that would also be perhaps more consistent with the archaeological record, as there is a step change in number of Middle Stone Age sites at that time, as well as all those innovations that I talked about. But this issue remains very much unresolved. So I will leave you with a summary of what I think are the main aspects of our extended origin. So first, we have elements of the original out of Africa model that remain consistent with our new data. So modern humans have a recent African origin. We may have a deep lineage history, but our origin remains relatively recent. And the main dispersal of modern humans took place in the last 100,000 years and largely replaced Eurasian hominins. We have a number of new insights that are from all the data that has accumulated in the last 20 years or so. So the lineage that led to modern humans on the one hand and Neanderthals and Denisovans on the other originated during a mega drought in Africa. Modern humans dispersed out of Africa multiple times, and those dispersals had different spatial extents and evolutionary impact. The modern human occupation of Eurasia included some assimilation of local archaic populations. And all modern humans share unique brain shape and a unique life history that has major implications towards behavior and sociality. We also have a number of points of controversy or debate that remain, and this makes the field even more exciting than when I started all those years ago. What is the last common ancestor of Sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans? What are the spatial and demographic parameters of our African origins? And what are the key adaptations in our Sapiens lineage? And with that, I leave you with special thanks to Sergey and Pete for the invitation, Eric for all the help. Apologies to all of you for having broken down on the internet, and thanks to the people who fund our work, and especially Rob Foley and our colleagues in Turkana.
Thank you very much, Marta. This was very informative. We have several panelists here who are kind of the speakers in this series. And I wonder if they have any questions for you. Pete, Chris? Well, let me ask you.
You can see his hand.
Yeah, let me ask you. I actually have two quick questions. So did I understand it right that you said that some of the tools that modern humans or our ancestors invented in Africa or very similar tools appeared a couple 100,000 years later in Europe and that Neanderthals were using them? Is it what you said?
No, what I'm saying is that they appear virtually at the same time. And this has always been one of the puzzles. So
okay.
Yeah, the point of origin may be slightly older in Africa, but they appear virtually at the same time.
Okay. And the second one is kind of more general. So you described a number of changes, adaptations, like energetic changes, ecological and social changes. And you were also talking about selective factors. So, I mean, which selective forces were the most important, you think? Which were like the trigger? Of course, environment was changing, there were growing fluctuations, but you kind of gave a pretty complex picture. I wonder if one can identify something that gave the initial push. I don't know.
Yeah, but I don't have that answer. And partly one of the problems is that until we know where humans are evolving, modern humans, I mean Homo sapiens, whether it is in many places in contact with each other or in one region, it's very difficult to then talk about particular selective pressures. But if we think about the arid and wet episodes and what that tells us about Africa, what I think modern humans do is that they produce a body that is cheaper. We can grow more slowly and be lighter and cost less during growth and put less pressure on the early provisioning of those children, at the cost then of having to look after them. And so I think that the pressure is energetic. I think the pressure is for a more efficient, energetic body. And it can only be solved with a more complex sociality. And that is also the pressure then on, I think, on the behavior and the neurology. But I don't know. That's what I think.
Pete, it looks like you have a question.
Yes. So, Marta, how common do you think any of these people in Africa were? My impression from the scarcity of the fossils is that that African humans in the Pleistocene and Eurasian ones, as far as that goes, were never as common as say hunter-gatherers in the Holocene. That humans were pretty rare throughout most of our evolutionary history. Maybe rare sometimes and other times in these mega droughts, but were we ever? Is there any evidence we were ever very common until a Holocene?
Yeah, so I think that there's certainly nothing like the Holocene. I mean, the Holocene, it's a different demography altogether. So the only evidence we have at the moment is from genetics. And the genetics are very extraordinary in the things they're revealing. So I'll mention again this study published last year by Karine Slebush on the whole genome of those Khoisan individuals. And they use this data to actually calculate the ancestral effective population size. And their estimate is that 300,000 years ago was an effective, a reproductive population of about 30,000 people. However, they also find evidence that that population crashed subsequently and may have reduced to about 10,000 or less before then the big out of Africa expansion. The information, the images coming now for Neanderthals is quite extraordinary. So Neanderthals, in the recent paper of the Shagarskia genome of Neanderthals, it is so clear that they have moments of big expansions because they can go all the way to Siberia and so on, and then they collapse. They cannot sustain those large demographic extents. And we now have evidence that they were inbred in Siberia and so on. But most of all, that recurrent, so two Neanderthal fossils in Siberia from different periods, each of them is more closely related to Western European Neanderthals than to each other. So this is evidence that they're expanding, collapsing, expanding, collapsing. So it's a very unstable demography.
Thanks. Lou, looks you have a question?
I think Chris was before me. Chris had his hand up first.
Okay. Okay, Chris.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yeah. Hello, Chris.
Hi. Great talk, Marta. Yeah, so a comment really and a question. So I think what's also interesting, you mentioned about us being a kind of economical kind of human, and I think that's backed up by the data on the Neanderthal rib cage, which of course was worked on in the last 6 months or so. So what it looks like is that Neanderthals and probably now Homo erectus had much bigger lungs, probably much bigger internal organs in the trunk. So maybe 20% more lung power than Neanderthals.
It's extraordinary. Isn't that amazing? But then imagine if they reached that by the age of 7 or 6 or 10. Yeah. So this would have been children the size of adults. So it's a completely different process of growing, how much food you need and so on. Of course, then you're a pretty big person at age 10, right?
Yeah.
rather than a weak
Having to
child.
maintain those big bodies, and we were an energetically more efficient solution, maybe.
Yeah, that's, I think it's a big thing here.
And a question really. So you obviously speculated about where the early Denisovans might be. I wonder whether you have any views on the material from Yunxian. You know, these two skulls, they're very distorted, but they're supposed to be about 600,000 years old. I've compared them with Heidelbergensis, but they're probably not. Any thoughts on those?
No, not really. I have only seen the squashed version of them, and I've never studied them, and what I've seen is totally squashed. And there's so much coming out of China right now, and we are all waiting anxiously for a paper that is about to come. And it's so exciting, but they are all relatively late.
Yes.
So no views on Yunxian. What are yours, by the way?
Yeah, so the Yunxian, back on Yunxian, yeah. So I think one of them is less distorted than the other. They're really large compared with the standard erectuses. They don't seem to have the cranial buttressing and the angulation of the erectus. So I think they are something different. What they are, of course, is another issue, and whether there's still a big time gap between them and any of the later things that might be Denisovans. So yeah, but I think Denisovan origins is going to be an exciting thing for the future.
It's exciting. It's very exciting. No?
So thanks.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, Marta. Thank you for that lovely talk.
Yeah.
I was just obviously these patterns of evolution in space as well as time and the variety that you're talking about. It reminds me of baboon evolution. So I was wondering, and there's the human record is so much more fragmentary and everything. Do you think that this is like a time for a big renewal of how baboons can be used as analogues of human evolution in terms of these patterns of evolution in space and time, because the record is so much better there, and they do show these same patterns of fragmentation and coming together and moving apart that you see in the humans?
My impression is that there were always more baboons than people. I don't know if this is right, but I really do not know, because I know very little about the evolution of baboons. But one looks at the distribution of the contiguous baboon subspecies, species, whatever they are, and one gets an impression of pretty stable ecological domains, of stable populations. But I don't know if I've created that image, and maybe they're not. I mean, baboons, of course, they're also interesting with the Scupengi hybrid and the positive selection of a hybrid form, isn't it? Which could also find parallels with hominins. Yeah, looking at baboons. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have some questions from the audience. The first one, is there any evidence of some migration into Africa?
There is at the moment, there is evidence that it's been put forth that there is some Neanderthal DNA in Africa. But of course, I mean, so what I think that we don't know yet is whether that relates to more recent migrants that have brought that DNA or not. I think that there is pretty good evidence that from the ancient genomes from the caves of Taforalt and so on, that there was contact across the Mediterranean. So if populations from the North and the South Mediterranean were in contact, whether they went all the way around, then there's always the potential that something may have filtered down to sub-Saharan Africa. However, I also think that the way that climate changes, when the Sahara greens, the process is from south to north. So I think that there is a pressure for African faunas to move north rather than the other way around. So I think there is a directionality to dispersals.
Thank you. Are there any precedents for such energetic excellence in our life forms before hominins? Are there any similarities in the evolution of such energetic excellence?
In other life forms,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean by other life forms. By in other animals?
Yeah, some other species. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, species have played with energetics and body size all through evolutionary history. And actually, the island dwarfs island dwarfs and island giants are direct responses to being able to grow larger or smaller into better adapted body sizes and metabolic rates. So yes, I think that the playing with both life history and body size is one of the main mechanisms of animal adaptation.
Thank you. Is there any evidence of genocide or hostile interactions between Homo sapiens and other hominins, Neanderthals?
No, there isn't. But we have to remember that it is very difficult. So we only have that evidence would come only from fossils, and we find fossils one bit at a time. And if you have only one bit, even if it has evidence of trauma, and there's certainly Neanderthals with evidence of trauma, it could have been interpersonal violence rather than intergroup violence. So at the moment, there is no evidence of serious intergroup violence, much less genocide.
Thank you.
I'm not saying they didn't fight, but we don't have any evidence with it.
How do you think the mega drought periods of contraction and fragmentation affected populations reintegrating with each other? Would this have pushed and improved social collaborative capabilities of sapiens?
Super interesting question. I think it depends for how long populations are apart and what behavior and behavioral and social features they develop that tell them apart from each other. So I think that during that mega drought, if that mega drought really was 200, 300,000 years of duration, as the evidence suggests, then that is enough for people when they meet again, not recognizing themselves as being the same population at all. So then it's just a question of how different do you have to feel somebody is for you to engage in some form of relationship. What I think is fascinating about humans is that no matter the distance, we are able to build social networks that go beyond the distance. And I think that this is part of what happens in that later Middle Pleistocene, when social networks must have increased. So even if populations were distributed in a landscape, they would have kept mechanisms, maybe exchanging wives and husbands, maybe putting, I don't know, we have examples in pastoralists where you leave some animals with one and so they didn't have domesticated animals then, but you could do it with objects. So building social networks that are actually much larger than your local population. And I think that is a very important feature of our species.
Thank you. And there is another question about fragmentation. Is there evidence for similar population fragmentation and diversification in other large mammals or other animals in general during this period that parallel the hominin evidence that you present?
That's what I want to do in my next project. I don't know the answer to that. And if it's true of hominins, it should be true of other animals, because if there is such a strong ecological process, we should find it in the others. This period between 1 million and 500,000 is one of which we have very, very few paleontological sites with good evidence. So we know extraordinarily little, but that's in a few years, we'll do that.
Thank you. Yeah, there is a very technical question. How does the Jebel Irnut mandible compare morphologically with the one from Girardon Cave in Jiangxi, South China?
Oh, I'm not sure. I have not seen either. I have seen pictures of both, but that is all. We have here a situation in which we have things like these incipient chins or that are seen through micro-CT analysis that shows internal structures and so on. And we're not entirely sure what is the meaning of these characters and how they compare. I think that the Chinese material that is being published at the moment at fastest speed is going to throw a number of very interesting surprises, in fact. And, you know, can I say in the talk, I stress the relationship between Africa and Western Eurasia as a repeated period of contact. But we don't know if there wasn't further expansions that went all the way across Eurasia.
Thank you. And we have a kind of similar question. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. Do you think that the Jebel Irnut and Flores bed fossils would be better interpreted as late forms of archaic humans, Homo heidelbergensis, instead of early Homo sapiens, counter Pan-African proponents, since the crucial trait of cranial globularity is lacking? Thank you.
Yes, they don't have that globular skull, and even that chin in the new Ehud mandible, it's only just there. But in a way, so if we really are trying to pinpoint a moment of evolution in the fossil record, establishing that boundary, it's almost like chasing an impossible target. So imagine if I'm correct, and what you have is a moment of intense expansions, contractions for a period of time. These populations will all differ slightly from each other, but they represent the dynamics of a group that is evolving, even if they are at points, one is in the north, one is in the south, one is in the east, and so on. What is interesting is that why do we have then sort of the morphological coalescence of the traits? Is it that they didn't survive? And it doesn't mean that they were not part of the Sapiens lineage, and that only one population survived. And should we then mark that as the origin of a species and give it a different name? I am not sure. I think that we need to know a little bit more about the shape of what happened before to be able to decide. And then it will be an ad hoc decision. We will have to make a theoretical decision at that point. I include them only from the moment in which they have the derived features or not.
Thank you. Does the presently available data could answer the question whether it was hominins or climate that played a role in the turnover of faunal dynamics of Africa?
I don't know. I don't think we know, to say the truth. So again, keeping in mind that we have such poor fossil, not just hominins, fossil fauna from East Africa in particular in this later Middle Pleistocene, just the fact that Tyler Faith and the colleagues that were able to show this change is largely based on what they observed in Lanyamokan or Lorgasilene. So it's very little evidence at the moment. And I think that it's very powerful what they are showing, and it makes total sense. But we need more to be able to say, are these evolutionary patterns across mammals of a big region? Is it climatic, ecological, or are hominins actually having an effect on them? What is interesting, of course, is that this Middle Stone Age, this Mode 3 technology that is evolving at the same time, and it's spreading, it's also in Europe soon after, that includes projectiles. And it could be that once hominins have serious projectile technology, that they do affect how their hunting has a serious impact on the fauna.
Thank you. And there is one kind of a personal question. What is that framed picture mounted on the wall behind you in your study? No, and I think the person who is asking,
down there.
yeah, and I think the person who is asking knows what it is, because the second part is it now outdated or superseded given your exciting new research?
So that picture down there, is that the one you're talking about?
I guess.
Yeah. So that was drawn when Andrea Emiliano published that beautiful study in 2017, and they had an artist draw a series of pictures, and one of which went to the actual cover of the journal they were publishing in. That was that one. And the artist made another drawing that went with it at the time, and I got it as a present.
Okay. Well, we have a couple of more questions, but I think we should stop now and thank Marta again. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you, and again, apologies about the internet failure.
Oh, it was good. No, don't worry at all. And thank you to everybody for your attention. And I hope we'll see you next week when we'll be actually talking about ancient epidemics. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marta.
Thank you, Pete, Sergey.
And with that, I will end the seminar. Have a great week. See you next week. Bye.
Thank you, Eric.